Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards, the video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. Today we are looking at Mountebank. This is a 5-cost action and attack card from Prosperity, and it says, +2 coins, each other player may discard a curse. If they don't, they gain a curse and a copper. Mountebank is incredibly strong. It is arguably within the top 5 most powerful cards in all of Dominion, and it's definitely within the top 10. I think it's in the top 5, and yes, that does mean I think that Prosperity expansion has 3 cards that are in the top 5 most powerful cards in the game: Goons, King's Court, and a Mountebank. Prosperity just... the cards in it are either really, really powerful, or basically they're just a bit rubbish. It's very, very swings to the extremes. That's just how it is. Now, Mountebank is a double junking attack. It gives out 2 junk cards when played, and junking attacks are already one of the stronger types of attack cards available. So this is double the amount than most other junking cards for what is already pretty strong. So that's pretty wild. Now, not only does Mountebank start off by giving out junk at double the speed, but once the curses run out, it continues to hand out coppers. So for most player counts, the copper pile is very, very much larger than the curse pile. So think about 2-player, there's 10 curses and 46 coppers, I think. So the junking, realistically, for 2-player, it just doesn't stop. You're just going to keep giving them some form of junk card. Yes, it's at a slightly reduced rate, but it still just keeps on going into their deck. Now, with 4-player, what's the copper pile size? I think it's 32, and curses are 30, so they're roughly the same. But that's the only player count where they are roughly the same, because you add more coppers when you go to 5-player or 6-player. You add an extra 60 to the pile. So, yeah. Realistically, for most player counts, the Mountebank just keeps junking for a very, very long time. Now, it does admittedly have sort of a self-defense built into it, like a mini moat. If you have a curse in your hand, you can discard one to not receive any junk, but it is worth noting that they have to discard the curse, and so this is only going to save them one time, right? Not like Moat, where you keep revealing it to every play. Each curse in your hand only going to save you one time from a Mountebanking. So it's not always a double junker, but it will be at first, and realistically, because the curse has to be in their hand, they're not going to block a bunch of the time, right? They just won't have the curse in their hand. Unless they get really, really lucky, and that can be annoying and swingy. It does happen sometimes, you just get all of your Mountebanks blocked, but it's not always going to happen. It doesn't happen that often. So Mountebank dominates most of the kingdoms it appears in because it junks really, really quickly. It's unlikely that you will have trashing available that's fast enough to keep up. It is possible, but of course it just means that ways to keep your deck thin, a lot of them are less viable than they normally might be because of the fact that the junk's coming in at a much faster rate. The attack stacks like most junking attacks, and the built-in defense doesn't really block multiple plays because each curse only saves you one time. So in higher player counts, where you're more likely to have attacks played on you between your turns, keeping up with trashing the incoming junk is usually going to be impossible, right? Junking attacks throw junk into your deck a lot faster the higher the player counts go up, and Mountebank is already really fast at junking, so you're just going to get swamped completely and utterly. The more players you add, the worse it's going to get. So because Mountebank is so ridiculously powerful, it's a fairly high priority card. Most of the time, Mountebank is a race to destroy your opponent's deck before they can do that to you. A very high priority card as a result. Now, what you're aiming to do is to be the first to get your deck in a situation where you can play Mountebank as often as you realistically can. Now, whether that deck is some sort of lean, mean engine that King's Court's Mountebanks, or whether it's just going to be like a slog that cycles slowly and just has multiple copies of Mountebank in it, that's really going to depend on the rest of the kingdom. But if you can get to a state where you can play multiple Mountebanks every turn, this is very strong because realistically your opponent can't block it from just the self-defense on Mountebank alone. If you can play multiple copies, they're not going to have enough curses in the hand. Obviously, if there are other full attack immunity cards like Lighthouse or Champion available, well, that's the same for all attacks, doesn't matter then. But the self-defense, it can't deal with multiple plays. Okay, so do we try to get deck control first? Like, we say that Mountebank is a high priority card, but when do we actually buy it and add it to our deck? So if you can trash quickly enough, then the usual rule of getting your deck under control first in preparation of the incoming junk still holds. So I talked about this in the Witch video, but it's a very generic rule that really applies to all of the junkers. A lot of the time, if you want to keep your deck under control from junking attacks, you need to have your deck in a state where you can actually pair up your trashing with your junk, and that means you kind of need to get your deck under control as soon as possible before you start junking, so that when the junk comes in, your deck can stay lean and it can play your junking attack every turn because you can draw your deck. It's why cards like Chapel are so good at getting your deck really thin and under control straight away. But it is worth noting that Mountebank junks at double the speed, so you've got to be really, really fast with the trashing to actually get your deck under control. Because it's not just one junk card coming in, it's actually two. So you're going to be looking for trashers that can trash multiple cards, like Sentry or Chapel, are just examples from the base game, or trashers that will allow you to start getting thin while still hitting 5 early, so you can buy the Mountebank straight away. Stuff like Moneylender. Sometimes you've got trashing that's slow and leaves you with low value turns. So Trade Route from Prosperity is an example. You'll have the action, you'll trash one card. It doesn't really give you any money for doing it, so you thin your deck very slowly, and you can't buy your own Mountebanks. And this can be a problem, because the junk will just come in faster than you can trash, and you haven't been able to buy any Mountebanks of your own, and now you're in an even worse position, because if you do get a Mountebank, you're going to cycle a lot more slowly than your opponent, while they are more reasonable to keep thin, right? Because you start junking them later, so they've got their deck under better control, arguably, while yours just falls apart. So in that case, if the trashing is bad, you just need to get the Mountebank straight away. You probably don't have time to get your deck under control. You've got to throw the junk at your opponent straight away. Now, if you can get your deck under control, this self-defense still might be worthwhile that Mountebank has. So you might want to keep a curse around, because that way you basically waste one of their Mountebanks. But of course you need the curse in your opening hand. So some of the stuff we discussed in the Moat video for the base game will still apply here. There are ways sometimes to ensure that a card is in your hand every turn. So you might have something like Save. Obviously you're not playing the curse, so it'll be in your hand during your buy phase, so you can just save it for next turn. Or you might have top deckers like Artisan, or ending your draw with a Courtyard, that sort of thing. Now bear in mind, of course, this isn't as good as putting a Moat in your hand. Again, it only saves you one time, and of course you have to discard it, so it's not guaranteed that you've drawn it back up again to actually do all of this saving a second time. But still, it might be better to try and do this than just constantly eating 2 junk cards throwing into your deck. And while you are getting your deck under control, if it's something that you think you're going to be able to do, you may want to prioritise trashing coppers and estates before the curses, just because the more curses that you have left in your deck, the more chances there are that you'll have one in your starting hand, and you can just save yourself from getting more junk incoming. Eventually you'll probably get rid of it, but, if you can only trash so many cards per turn, then, yeah, maybe you want to keep curses. If you had a Steward and 3 junk cards in your hand, like an estate, a copper, and a curse, maybe you just trash the copper and the estate and you leave the curse around just for a little bit longer, in the hope that maybe it will save you from an attack. So a lot of the time, because Mountebank puts a lot of pressure on how good a Treasure needs to be to help keep your deck under control. The reality is that your deck's just going to get destroyed. It just can't keep up with Mountebank. Even if an engine is possible but weak, it might be that the engine just can't overcome the Mountebanking. So in these cases, you should probably, as much as you can, try and recognise to say, okay, this deck isn't good enough to overcome Mountebank, so therefore you want to try and optimise your deck around basically not being able to build an engine, going for a slog game where you just have no control. You're just drawing very slowly through a massive deck, because that's inevitably how it's going to end up. Now, it's still important in these sorts of decks that you try and play your own Mountebanks even when you're in this situation, because if you don't, your opponent might be able to go and build that weak engine, and then they're going to crush you because they can just play a whole load of Mountebanks on you every turn, and your deck is even worse. Basically, they'll be able to build while your deck just very, very slow, can't really do anything. Now, sometimes it might still be worth initially thinking about trying to build the engine anyway, just in case your opponent does that, where they don't really respond to you with their own Mountebanks and they let you get that deck control. Obviously, this is a case of you shouldn't really be assuming that your opponent's going to play poorly, but sometimes you just sort of don't really know how the game's going to go, and the engine might be good enough that it's like, well, okay, you're going to try it anyway, but then as the game progresses, you start to realise that actually it's not really looking feasible, and in that case, it might be a good idea to pivot more towards a slog all of a sudden, as soon as you realise that that's happening. You don't have to make the decision straight away at the beginning of the game, but you should try to keep a lookout and notice when the deck's just not going to work because Mountebank is just taking control of the game too much. So despite its incredible power, occasionally you might not actually want to get any Mountebanks and add it to your deck. So when is that going to be? And that's usually going to be the case when the deck control is so fast and easy that basically the junking is not a problem, which does happen sometimes. And it's worth noting that unlike some junkers like Witch and Torturer, Mountebank is a stock card. It doesn't draw you cards. And so that means that you're not really contributing to building your own engine when you add Mountebank to your deck. That means that you might sometimes prioritise something like Witch or Torturer over a Mountebank just because you really need the card draw, and, getting one junk out there is fine. It's not as good as two, but your own card draw is more important. If the attack is not really doing anything from Mountebank, then bear in mind it is just a terminal silver. You are getting 2 coins for spending an action, and that's pretty weak, especially one that cost you 5, basically just for a terminal silver. That's a disaster card. At least cards like Torture and Witch are drawing you cards if the attack's not mattering, but Mountebank doesn't do that. So, yeah, a lot of the time, if your deck falls apart, the fact that Witch and Torture draw probably doesn't matter all that much by comparison, compared to the raw junking power of Mountebank. But if the deck control's really easy, then yeah, the fact that Mountebank's not drawing actually does start to become relevant, and you might choose something else, or to just forego junking entirely because the deck control's just too easy and it's too fast. Also, occasionally, because Mountebank is different from other junkers in that it gives out a lot of coppers as well, you may find that there are ways in which your opponent gets to get more value out of effectively having a load of coppers in their deck. And in that case, Mountebank might not be quite so appealing, and it really reduces the value. One example is Counting House. Now, I didn't mention Mountebank in the Counting House video, but as called out on a comment, I probably should have, and so I'll just correct that here to say that, hey, Counting House can actually deal with decks that are stuffed full of copper. If you're building a slog, where you're just not cycling very quickly and you're getting all these coppers thrown into your deck, then if you draw a Counting House at the right time, towards the end of the deck, that could help you jump all the way up to buying a colony even one time. And that huge one turn where you got a load of points might actually be enough to basically keep ahead on the slog and ultimately end up winning the game. So your deck has to basically be completely destroyed, and you're sort of gambling on the counting house, but like it can really earn you a lot, right? It's not actually very hard for counting house to be drawing you like 5 or more coppers, even if it's not drawn towards the end of the deck, because you will potentially have quite a lot of coppers in your deck. So that expands the number of places where it can end up in your deck and still be useful, right? Like normally it has to be at the end or you're in trouble, but actually it could be somewhere towards the middle and still be like a huge value card for you. Because Mountebank is a double junker, Gardens is also more likely to actually be worth something, and Gardens works okay in slog decks, right? It doesn't scale fast enough is the problem, but if you're getting like a load of junk from your opponent, actually the Gardens can suddenly be worth quite a fair bit of points. Fountain is another classic. If you have 10 coppers or more, you get 15 points. So an opponent that just tries to like end the game in another way and just give up on the engine, you end up throwing a whole load of points into their deck just by Fountain being there. Even if they've trashed them, it's likely that they'll end up back at 10 coppers or more, and suddenly that's like 2.5 provinces that they just suddenly get in points. Keep is similar, but not as good in that they're probably going to win the copper split for keep and just get 5 points from that. It's like a 10-point swing because you're not going to get it if you like drown them in coppers, which does make a difference, but it's not as big as Fountain. And lastly, although it only really matters for 4-player games because the copper pile is roughly the same size as the curse pile, Tower, if 11 Mountebanks are played in total in a 4-player game, which is actually probably likely because you've got like 3 opponents, then suddenly you've got 2 empty piles, and one of them is the copper pile, and suddenly all of your opponents are jumping up like a huge number of points, and 2 piles are empty, and it's only 1 more pile and the game ends. So like it can be worthwhile if you see your opponents going for Mountebank, just look to empty some other pile, and then suddenly the game ends, and all of a sudden you get this huge number of points because they've been throwing all of these cards into your deck that are now actually worth points when normally they wouldn't be. Just a few final bits about Mountebank here. So this is, I'd say, the card that is most likely to end up with you having to play a game where your deck is non-functional, like a slog. Like you just can't really do anything, and a lot of the cards don't matter. You cycle really slowly. You never see them. You probably shouldn't play with this in games with more than 2 players. That is because stackable attacks stack very strongly, no more so than this. The more players you have, the more likely you are to just get multiple stacks of a card. And of course, Mountebank gets a little bit better when multiple are played in a turn, because you can't use its built-in defense. Like eventually it breaks through, you run out of curses in your hand, and so like the stacking's really nasty. And so the more players you add, like your deck is going to get junk in faster anyway because it's multiplayer, but it's just so fast. It just destroys games. Mountebank with 4-player, just like miserable experience, really. You just can't do anything effectively. This is a card on my ban list alongside the likes of Possession, just because I got tired of the fact that it basically just ruined all my games. It's like, oh, this kingdom looks like it might be interesting, but nope, it had Mountebank, so you couldn't really do anything, and none of the rest of the kingdom really mattered. That happens quite a lot, right? Because it's so strong, but it's really strong, I find, in a way that tends to lead you to playing very samey games, because you can't really do anything with your deck. So it's just like, oh, here's a game, you just got to play Mountebank a lot, and now suddenly no one can do anything anymore. So, fine. That's just why I got rid of it, basically. But it's up to you. That's just not strategy, that's just my personal opinion, but I just wanted to throw it out there. I really don't like this card. Anyway, what we're going to do now is we're going to head over to the online client. We're going to generate some boards with Mountebank forced in, and we're going to see what impact it has. Oh good, Possession as well. So what have we got here? We have, there's Workers' Village and City as villages, and we've got Library for draw, and there is Mill to discard. So theoretically there's like an engine there, because you've got Sentry to trash as well, and that trashes 2 cards at once. So, you know what? Realistically, you might actually be able to keep on top of the junk here. And you have got sort of a draw engine, but it's quite expensive, I guess. Mill is quite nice, though, actually. And what are you going to do with that engine? So you can draw a lot of cards. And then what? Is there any plus buy? Yes, because there's Workers' Village. There's Contraband, but it sort of sucks, I guess. And do you really want to possess your opponent? So let's imagine you build an engine, you Mountebank your opponent to death. Would you even bother to possess them? Probably not, to be honest. I think that it's worth going initially to try and build the engine and Mountebank your opponent to pieces. Realistically, because there's nothing... because all the cards are really quite expensive, they all cost 5. If your opponent gets swamped, they can't really do anything, right? There's no... they can mill into, Duchy, but that's not very good. They wouldn't really want to add, Contraband or Royal Seal, because they don't feel like they'd be doing anything. So I think trying to go for an engine that just wrecks your opponent is important, and I would actually go for a Sentry or 2 before I pick up a Mountebank, maybe. Because if they get a Mountebank and I get a Sentry, well, my Sentry counteracts the Mountebank. They add 2 junk cards. I trash 2 junk cards, hopefully. But I could get 2 Sentries, and then it's a lot harder for them without... It's the only way to trash, and they have to do it as well, or their decks just... I'll eventually get thin while they're not really doing anything. So I think this is just a classic get thin, and you've got to try and Mountebank, and you open Mill Silver to maximise the chance of hitting 5. Or you hit 5 straight away and you buy Sentry, of course. And you eventually build this draw engine and you drown your opponent, and the cities will eventually switch on, at least to being labs, because the curses are going to run out. And you've got library to draw as well with Mill if you want to, but it might be quite hard to buy enough mills to make library good. I don't know, but I think that there's the engine. You're just looking to play a lot of Mountebanks, really. And then eventually maybe you can get a bank, but you probably just buy some golds and you don't bother. I don't know. I guess you don't necessarily need to build that big. It's fairly slow, and at least buying a lot of mills gets you some extra points as well. So Mountebank is the main payload of this engine. You do need 2 Sentries before you pick up a Mountebank, but other than that, it's just play Mountebank. If you can play 2 or 3 Mountebanks on your opponent every turn, they're in big trouble, especially if it's 3. What are they going to do? And possession, just your opponent's deck is too rubbish to make possession good, I think. So that's it for that one. I expect Mountebank will be very important in all of these, to be honest. Here we have Chapel, which is exceptional trashing. Okay, that's interesting. There is another alternative junker as Familiar, but I'm not going to bother with Familiar when there's Mountebank. It's just way easier to get. There's also Upgrade for keeping thin, and, arguably there's Mint. What is there for engine? Well, there's City, and there's Moat, or Council Room for draw. So interesting that you can add City Moat and then actually have good coverage, and also you get thin really fast. So I actually think this might be a board where Mountebank is no good, interestingly enough, because it's very easy to keep thin, right? You got upgrades, you got Chapel, there's a strong draw with Council Room, or the Moat. You go down the Moat route and then the Mountebank doesn't hurt you anymore. And so ironically, I was just saying, I think Mountebank will be used in all these, but this actually might be a Mountebank skip board. I guess the only problem is that you've got to be buying these expensive cards like City, Council Room. Well, there is Moat that's cheap, but the problem is the Village costs 5. That's the worrying thing. So it's actually, from a Chapel situation, it's hard to get up to the state where you're able to start, I guess, working on your engine. But having said that, because there's a lot of contest for 5, I think building the engine is more important than the Mountebank. So I think I'd go for City Council Room. I don't bother with Moat because I'll be able to keep my deck clean, and my opponent realistically might not be buying Mountebank anyway because it's too easy to keep on top of the junk. So I think this is actually a Mountebank skip board. They do happen occasionally, but there's just multiple things working against Mountebank here. Moat as draw and Chapel, and so you're probably not going to get Familiar either for the same sort of reasons. And so it's, I don't know, you draw with City Council Room and then you Courtier. You need something, so you might have a Moat because it's got 2 types and you can gain some golds and money, and you just build a big Council Room thing, I guess. And if your opponent, for some bizarre reason, what else are they going to do? I was going to say, you could potentially punish them with Mountebank, but I don't even know if you could. I don't know what else your opponent would do. So I think this is sort of the very rare Mountebank skip board. The board is just too good against Mountebank. So, And there's always upgrades as well, to keep on top of things. So we got King's Court Mountebank. Well, that's spooky. Also, there is no village. Well, no, that's not true. There's King's Court. We have Moneylender for trashing, which is all right to open with, actually. On a 3-4, we open either Courtyard Moneylender or Silver Moneylender. Maybe Courtyard Moneylender's better. To get that cycling and find the Moneylender earlier, you just top deck it. But I think I prefer having the Courtyard long term for King's Courts. And well, realistically, I think you've got to get in on the Mountebanking because the only trashing is Moneylender. The curses can't be trashed. And also, this board wants you to pair up King's Courts, but that's actually quite difficult when you are filled with curses and coppers. And the trashing of the coppers is really slow. So I think that although King's Court Mountebank engine with laboratory for draw or drawing with council rooms and so on, it sounds insane, but actually getting there is going to be very, very difficult, I think. So I think that we do actually prioritise Mountebank. So we open Moneylender Courtyard. On the first 5, I probably get a Mountebank. And I basically just hope that my opponent's deck stinks too bad. And then after that, I'm getting... Do I want Laboratory or Minions? Probably Laboratory. I think long-term I would rather draw with Council Room. And eventually King's Court. You can just play King's Court on Mountebank. It generates you a lot of money. You have plus buy from Council Room. And, yeah, you have ways to draw with Courtyard Lab. But... it's very inconsistent, but when you do get a powerful turn with King's Court, if you try to build the engine, your opponent's destroyed. Basically, if you have a turn where you can play Mountebank 6 times by King's Courting 2 of them, your opponent is just dead at that point. So I think this is one where you open as though you're going to try and build an engine, but you immediately get Mountebanks and then nobody actually builds an engine, it doesn't really work. And so what else are you going to do? Well, I don't think you talisman into a bunch of silvers. That doesn't feel good. So I guess you just buy a bunch of silvers and courtyards and maybe you top deck a curse. That's another reason to get Courtyard, right? You can top deck a curse potentially for your next turn. Save a Mountebank. Maybe you do just try and build for a very long time because I honestly don't understand what else you would do on this kingdom. If you pivot too early into just going for the slog, I think you eventually lose because King's Court ends up being too strong. But, you can't pair up the King's Courts is the problem. You have to draw, King's Court with Lab to get the village effect and draw a bunch of cards and hope that you find another 2 King's Courts. But, at that point, you've got this huge deck filled with junk. And, eventually you get to King's Court and Moneylender and thin down a little bit. But, it seems really, really hard to actually build the engine here, so maybe you do just gun for... Well, what would you do? You'd expect curses to empty. Could you buy a load of duchies? Is it actually too difficult? You go for, merchant ships and then you go duchy. That just feels so bad. You have to get some Mountebanks instead. And then what do you do? Buy a load of estates very slowly? It just feels very poor. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you just get stuck in a quagmire of Mountebank slogs with no clear route for what to go. You just have to try and prioritise slapping your opponent with Mountebanks and make them fall over, and then no one really knows what to do anymore. So that's sort of kind of why I banned the card. But yeah, I think Mountebank is tremendously important on that board. You've got to prioritise it as your first 5, I think. So here we have Chapel again, and we also have Forge as like major speed trashers, but Forge is no use because we got Chapel, which is just way better. We have University, and we have like Watchtower. So interestingly, Watchtower, of course, can trash the incoming junk. We do have Watchtower Goons, so it's very worthwhile building the engine. We got University and Shantytown as villages, so there's lots of village support. And of course you can draw with Watchtower. In fact, Watchtower is the only draw. So Watchtower is extremely important card here. We're going to open Chapel and Potion, and we're just going to open, the start of the game is just getting universities and Watchtowers. And because we have extremely good Watchtower coverage, because it's our main draw, and we really want to like win the split on Watchtowers, honestly, you're probably never going for Mountebank. So it's another Mountebank skip, because again there's Chapel and there's Defence at the same time. For Mountebank, like Watchtower just throws all the cards in the bin, so you never bother, and it's actually a Goons Watchtower board where you buy a load of coppers yourself and just immediately trash them and get a lot of points. And you're drawing the Goons with your universities and shantytowns, and you're gaining them. Well, actually, you can't gain the Goons with the university, can you? But you can gain shantytowns and Watchtowers and maybe not poachers. Eventually, you just stop gaining stuff. There is embargo. You could embargo the Goons, funnily enough, if you ever, for some reason, have 2, and like you can buy an embargo at one point, I guess. Well, I don't know. You have to buy the Goons yourself, so maybe that's stupid. I don't know. Anyway, I think this is another Mountebank skip, as it turns out. There's just, like junking attack doesn't work at all on that board, because Watchtower is very good against junk attacks. And this Chapel. So this is the 5th and final Random Kingdom. We have Watchtower again, however this time there is no engine. It's the only trashing, and that's no good. And there's no village, so that's really no good. So what else are you going to do? Well, it's Colony Platinum game as well. I literally think it's a Mountebank slog. Like, there's nothing else you can do. You have to Mountebank your opponent. And stuff like Venture's no good because their deck is filled with coppers. Royal Seal sucks. Talisman stinks. What are they going to get? They can't even get like multiple islands. There is Watchtower, but I don't like it. Like, it's not very good to do Watchtower big money. I guess maybe it is. Maybe instead of Mountebank. Well, no, the problem is you're buying Watchtower over silver, and actually we need the silvers because it's a slog. Maybe that's better. I think we just Mountebank and, I don't know, islands, and then the curses and the islands run out and you buy like estates. I don't think anyone's getting up to colony on this board. Having an artisan would be nice. You might get some duchies out of that, actually. But I think you just open up by maximising your chance of getting in Mountebank early. So you could open Silver Watchtower. Actually, that is fine initially. Have that one Watchtower. It'll help you. But after that, you actually want to be playing Mountebanks, and you don't really want to be drawing them dead with a Watchtower. It is worth noting if you do have some curses, you can discard them, and then you can... Well, no, you wouldn't discard them, would you? You would... instead of trashing with Watchtower, you could discard the curses and then draw more with Watchtower, I guess. I don't know, if you have it in your hand. But I think it's a choice between Mountebank, Watchtower, Artisan is the thing you want to play. Bandit, it's too slow here. You don't get to play it often enough. I guess I would rather Mountebank my opponent, I suppose. I don't expect them to have anything that the attack of Bandit would hit, and the gold gain is not good enough, I guess. Yeah, so it's just, I think you have to Mountebank Slog. Like, if you don't Mountebank your opponent, what are they going to do? They actually get to do reasonable stuff, I guess, with like... Well, they just play their own Mountebanks more often, don't they? And then your deck is toast no matter what you do. So, yeah, this is just another sad board where Mountebank just cripples anything to do, really, and you're just drawing a load of coppers and curses, and eventually the estates run out, I suppose. I don't know. Well, whatever. Anyway, that's Mountebank, as you can see. I think we had an unusually high number of Mountebank skips. Like, we skipped it on 2 of the boards, which is unheard of, really. Like, out of 5, that's crazy. But that's just the way the cards rolled, I suppose. Anyway, Mountebank, just nuts strong, and I wouldn't really play with it if I was you, but that's just my opinion. It's too much junking too fast. Anyway, hope that was useful for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.